All right, today this is just a review for your quiz. Suggestion, watch this before you take the quiz. All right, and the review is on Pythagorean identity, the amplitude, the period, and the equation of a trig function, or just sine and cosine. That's all we're dealing with now. All right, so number one, Pythagorean identity. And there are three equations I can use, and they come from, the other two come from this one. Sine squared of theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. Now, if I just subtracted cosine from both sides, I'd get this equation. If I subtracted sine from both sides, I get this one. And I'm going to use the equation, like on this one, cosine. What is your cosine? I'm going to use this third one. I could always use this one. I can use that one. But the easiest one is to use this one. What you're looking for is what's on the left-hand side. So it's given that the sine is negative 2/3. Number one, I need to find out where is this. Well, because it's negative, I know it's either in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4 because your y or your sine is negative in 3 and 4. So what quadrant is this in? Well, pi is 180 degrees. 3 pi over 2 is 270. So this is in quadrant 3. Why is that important? Because the cosine in 3 is negative. So I know my answer to this problem is negative. And I'm going to just substitute into this equation. I'm going to replace the sine with negative 2/3, and I'm going to square that. So the equation, I'll write it over here. Cosine squared of theta is going to equal 1 minus the sine squared. Sine was negative 2/3, and I square that. Now, if I square negative 2/3, I get positive 4/9. It does not affect that negative sign or the minus sign, so it's still minus 4/9. All right, and I'm going to just replace 1 with 9/9 because that's still 1. And these two have the same denominator, so I can subtract those and get 5/9. Now notice, this says cosine squared theta equals 5/9, but this says find cosine. So I have to take the square root of that. So I take the square root of both of these, and that would give me cosine of theta equals the square root of 5. Can't simplify that. Over the square root of 9, which I can, which is 3. But remember, we said that answer was negative. Don't forget to put that in there. So what is the cosine when sine is negative 2/3? Negative square root 5 over 3. So that is the Pythagorean identity. The next one was amplitude. And the amplitude comes from these equations right here. It's just the absolute value of the coefficient of your sine or your cosine curve. And in this case, the amplitude is just the absolute value of negative 3, which is 3. Absolute value, I mean, the amplitude is always positive because you're taking the absolute value. It represents a distance. The distance is from the midline to the highest or lowest point. Very important. All right, these same equations here, the b value is what I'm going to use to find the period. Period of a sine or cosine curve is 2 pi divided by the absolute value. I notice some of you make a mistake on the homework. The period is never ever negative, it's always positive. Right, so because this is a fraction, I'm going to rewrite it in this form. And then we learned a long time ago, keep, change, flip. And that would give me a period of 4 pi. All right, so remember this formula right here to find period. The amplitude is just the absolute value. If I asked for the amplitude on this one, it would be 4. And then the last thing on the quiz, or we did on the homework, is given a graph, come up with the equation. Well, remember the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the highest or lowest point. The midline is not always the x-axis, so you have to be careful. The lowest point is down here at -3. The highest point is +3. The amplitude is just half that distance because the midline would cut the graph in half this way. So if you find the midline, then you just count up or down to the highest or lowest point. In this case, it's 3 up or 3 down, so the amplitude is 3. The period, here's another mistake I noticed on some of your homeworks. It's not this last one, sometimes it is, but it's when the graph finishes the cycle. And notice how this is at a maximum. The period is going to be, how long does it take to get back to a maximum? Here's another maximum. Okay, this is a minimum. How long does it take to get back there? So, and also it's a complete circle. You'll notice that I got back to a maximum right there. So my period is pi. That's how long it took to get to that, back to where we started. Not here this last one, even though I'm back to that maximum, that would be 2 periods there. All right, so now how do we find that b value? Well, I know the period is always 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. So I'm just going to take what I found to be my period and set it equal to that. I'm going to just make that a fraction so I can cross multiply. I'm going to take out the absolute value. So it's pi times b equals 2 pi times 1, or just 2 pi. If I divide by pi, b is going to equal 2. Okay, now how do I use that? Well, if you look back here, the b goes right over here after the sine or cosine. Now, which one is this? Is this sine or cosine? Well, I did not start at the midline. If I start at the midline, it's a sine. If I start above or below, it's a cosine. Now, because this was above, the number in front of the cosine will be a positive. If it started below the midline, then it would be a negative. And this is a cosine because it's above the midline. And then I just put my b in there, so cosine of 2x. This next one, very, very, very important. Okay, the amplitude is not 1 because that's not the midline. If you notice here, it's -3, the highest is +1. There's a distance of 4 there. So the middle would be half of 4, which is 2. My midline is right here. That's my midline. Now, how far is it from the midline to the highest or lowest? 1, 2. 1, 2. My amplitude is 2. All right, and then my period, how long does it take to get back here after you finish one complete cycle? If you can't read it, that's a pi, and this is a 2 pi. I want to get back to a 0. Here's a 0, but I haven't finished a whole circle or a whole cycle. I don't finish that whole cycle until I go around here again, and that would be 2 pi. So my period is 2 pi. Remember, period is never negative. Now, what is the b value? Take your period and set it equal to the formula used to find period. Well, I'm just going to make that a fraction. Cross multiply, I get 2 pi b equals 2 pi. If I divide by 2 pi, I get 1. So my b value is 1. Now, because I started at the midline, this is a sine. This one did not start at the midline on the y-axis, started above it. This one starts at the midline. This is a sine curve. Now, because it went to the right of that, it went up. This is a positive in front. If it went down here, it would have been a negative in front. Again, this is a sine curve. And then my b is 1, so 1x or just x. If you watch this and you practice, this is what the quiz is like, and you get an easy 100. Good luck.